Okay, we are on record now. So, a very good afternoon still to the listeners here, and a very good morning to our speaker, Professor Kirk Freudenberg. I would take this opportunity to formally introduce him. Professor Kirk Freudenberg, not that he needs much of an introduction, though, a simple Google search tells you a lot more about him than I would be due to the short span of time. Professor Kirk Freudenberg is Brooks and Susan Ragan Professor of Classics and Chair of the Department at Department of Classics, Yale University, Connecticut. He has been teaching there since 2006. He has a long list of wonderful research works, but I can't resist mentioning at least a few. First, I'd like to mention the wonderful book, The Walking Muse, Horace on the Theory of Satire, which I had read. And to be honest, that was when I decided that how about asking this wonderful thinker to share a few of his thoughts and observations on Horace's satire to our students live. And among other publications, other notable publications, he also has edited the Cambridge Companion to Roman Satire, and he has one upcoming book due for release this year. It's scheduled to be released from Cambridge University Press. It's on the book two of Horace's Satires, which features an introduction, text, and commentary. So I welcome you, Professor, and I really can't thank you enough for giving us some time from your very busy schedule. And I request the students to be attentive as our speaker has very carefully designed his lecture. We have been discussing this for some months now, and I think you will learn a lot from it. I also am looking forward to it. So without further ado, I hand over the session to our speaker. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mukhopadhyay. And I have one question for you. I did send a handout to you. Does everyone have that?
Yes, I distributed it. I think they all do.
Okay, so I'll be referring to that from time to time throughout my talk. Um, your professor has kindly asked me to give a lecture for about 1 hour, which is a little longer than I usually do, but he's also requested that I go rather slowly. So I think I will be filling the entire hour. I have my lecture right on my screen, so I think I can be looking at you as I speak. So I'm just going to go ahead and begin my lecture. And if you have your handout somewhere nearby, that would be great. What is Roman satire? Since antiquity, scholars have struggled to identify a solid core beneath the shifting surfaces of Ennius, Lucileus, Horace, Persius, and Juvenal. These are the poets who form the canon of Roman verse satire. With the most prolific of the group, Lucileus, now only a smattering of disconnected fragments. I will be talking a lot about Lucileus today since he's much talked about by Horace in the poem that you were assigned to read. The remains of the first satirist I mentioned, Ennius, are much slighter still, almost nothing. I won't have much to say about him. But here's the question: what central idea or set of ideas might allow us to control the stunning variety of the works of these satirists by means of a single streamlined generic formula? For the most part, the best attempts to control this mess have managed only to tell us that the genre's failure to hold together is its zero grade and its best way of constituting itself as a genre. The many ancient metaphors for satire as a genre, whether of stuffing, mishmash, heaps, overloaded plates, mostly the ancient critics used food metaphors to describe satire, poems that, like curries, have lots cooked into them. All these metaphors manage to tell us only that this is a hybrid and jumbled feast an anti-genre where anything goes, so we had better be prepared for a little bit of everything. The favorite satire metaphor in antiquity, later the preferred metaphor of Casaubon and Dryden, is that of a rustic harvest festival's stuffed or overloaded plate, the lanx satura, heaped high with a variety of foodstuffs and spilling over its edges. This is less a description of the genre's salient qualities than it is an expression of the scholar's own frustration in trying to contain satire inside the narrow confines of a too specific generic formula. Failing to plumb the works of Roman verse satire down to that rock-hard streamlined core because it's not there, scholars have been forced simply to heap these works en masse onto a single generic plate, a massive ritual serving platter, a lanx, and to call that plate satire. Once crammed with the full enormity of what we automatically count as satire, because that is what Lucileus, Horace, Persius, and Juvenal told us they were writing, the plate spills over, defying our efforts to neatly categorize and contain the works we have heaped it with. But the what is satire problem has embarrassed not only professional scholars since antiquity, it was there to be wrestled with and staged as a problem of writing by the ancient satirists themselves, those who wrote the poems that we're trying to describe. They take on that problem well before the late antique grammarians step in with their commentary solutions, and they treat it in great detail, performing their attention to it for as long as satire is written in Rome. We can no longer determine precisely what Lucileus's audiences in the late 2nd century BC were given to expect from finding the title Satires atop his page. But we can be quite sure that Lucileus did not give them whatever it was that the title gave them to expect. The shift from Lucileus to Horace is, by all accounts, and especially by Horace's own account, including the poem you read for today, equally abrupt and disorienting, to be repeated again in the transition from Horace to Persius, the Neronian satirist, and then the wildest of them all, the last from Persius to Juvenal, the satirist who wrote under the emperors Trajan and Hadrian. But the fact that each of these satirists seems free to turn his work in whatever bold new direction he likes should not lead us to assume that the genre's demands are slight or that the stakes of their making these changes are either inconsequential or precisely the same for each new satirist down the road. Far from it. By Horace's day, in the Rome of the early to mid-30s BCE, the stakes of changing satire are much larger than they ever could have been for Lucileus. For it was taken as gospel by many in Horace's audience that satire had reached its perfected state, its telos, already a century before with Lucileus, in his massive 30 books of satires. Horace's problem, as he himself describes it in his Sermones, note, he does not even dare call his poems satires in the first book, and we'll return to this as a meaningful problem in just a moment. Horace's problem is not that his audiences have no clear sense of what to expect from him. It's that they expect him to write satire, if that is in fact what he intends to write, just the way Lucileus, their Lucileus, had written it, or that he not write it at all. For them, his critics, at least this is what Horace would have us believe about them, Lucileus stood out as an unassailable classic who was not to be tampered with or challenged. His was a voice of uncompromised self-assurance from an age long past when noble Roman citizens could still speak who they were, expressing themselves as men of authority and conviction, men who were themselves not to be tampered with. That kind of speech was long gone by Horace's day, and it is a problem for him. Try as they might, Horace's Sermones, this means conversations, that's what the title means, but they are known more commonly as his satires. Horace's Sermones are chronically incapable of expressing themselves as Lucileus's satires had once done. The first three poems of Horace's first book, for example, his so-called diatribe satires, feature a few scattered moments performed in what might, with a stretch of the imagination, be considered a Lucilean mode, loose, scathing, and fleetingly obscene. But even with those moments taken into account, these poems do not begin to approach Lucileus's scale of unencumbered belligerence and sharp free speech, nor do they bite into. This is a metaphor that Persius will later use of Lucileus's poems. They do not bite into the power players and the big political issues that Lucileus lashed out at with his angry, wolfish teeth. Lucileus, a name, by the way, conjures the Greek word for wolf, lukos. And yet, at the beginning of his fourth poem, and here I'm going to refer you to number 1 on your handouts, so please take a look at that. At the beginning of his fourth poem, Horace gives us to believe that his sermones have elicited memories of Lucileus powerful enough to warrant...
Professor,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
The moment you said you are asking the students to refer to the handout,
Yes.
we lost you for a couple of seconds. So if you could come back to that.
Okay,
And
if you would look at...
If you think it would be helpful, I can also share the handout via the Google Meet presentation.
Okay, go ahead and do that. You can hear me now, though, right?
Yes,
well?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll have you look at the first passage on your handout right now. This is where Horace is describing his the reaction to his poetry, the negative reaction to his poetry, and he's defending himself against his critics by naming these famous poets from many centuries before. If you look at number 1 on your handout, I'll read this in English to you. The poets, Eupolis, Plotinus, and Aristophanes, and all other real men of old comedy, if anyone deserved lampooning, either because he was wicked and a thief, or because he was an adulterer or a murderer, or notorious in some other way, they would brand him with abundant free speech. Lucileus depends on them totally. These are the ones he follows, changing only their meters and rhythms. He's funny and keen-scented. Literally, Horace says his nose has been wiped clean, but his compositional style is rough. To defend himself, Horace, this is as if this were courtroom litigation, Horace brings up the precedents of 3 famous poets of Greek Old Comedy, Eupolis, Plotinus, and Aristophanes. The references to poets who wrote scathing political comedies 4 centuries before in a very different political milieu, democratic Athens of the 5th century BCE, 400 years before Horace writes these words. The real surprise delivered by these lines, I suspect, derives less from their exaggerations about Lucileus as Rome's old comic poet than from their daring to mention Lucileus at all. For here, quite unexpectedly, we are first given to believe that Horace actually has a Lucileus problem that he needs to set straight. Directly after the first 3 satires of his first book, these are mostly tame Epicurean commentaries on human folly, not free-speaking invectives against individuals, we may reasonably wonder how Lucileus comes into this picture at all. On what basis does Horace assume that his ironical Epicurean diatribes will have made us think of Lucileus as his one clear rival? Why not Lucretius, or more obviously Bion, the famed cynic street preacher, who's the clear source of much of what Horace has to say in his first several poems, including and right down to the description of Lucileus's having a well-wiped nose. Again, that's referring to something I just read from your handout. This is a famous saying of the cynic philosopher Bion of Borysthenes. Did Horace really think that that is what he was writing in the mild-mannered diatribes or satires after the manner of Lucileus? If so, how were we to know that? Horace has a big problem on his hands. Determined to bring back a genre that meant basically one thing to Romans of his day, it meant Lucileus, he cannot even bring himself to name his poems satire in his first book. There, the art of dodging the word satire becomes a game unto itself. Genus hoc scribendi, this type or this genre of writing, he says in line 24 of the poem that you read for today. Nescio quid nugarum, some trifle or other, he says in line 2 of poem 9. Hoc, this here, he says in the 10th poem. Sint qualiacumque, whatever the hell these things are, he says in the same poem. Haec ego ludo, these little productions I put on, again in the 10th poem. With each vague periphrasis, that is, words that get around the term satire, we sense the painstaking avoidance of that word, the one we're all thinking of, the one Lucileus makes us remember. By making a point of not naming the poems anything in particular, the problem of genre is allowed to dangle and to disturb, and it becomes ours to solve. This anxiety, so elaborately performed in Horace's first book, I think is not just a matter of the poet's Callimacheian sensibilities getting the better of him and keeping him from saying what his South Italian instincts urge him to say. And here, by Callimacheian sensibilities, I mean his subscribing to the refined and scholarly tastes of the librarian poets of 3rd and 2nd century Alexandria in Egypt. The most famous of these poets was Callimachus, who was very popular with Roman poets of Horace's day. Rather, it is also, and perhaps especially, a matter of Horace's having been born the son of a freed slave, and thus of his never having had the remotest chance of writing satire the way Lucileus had done. For Lucileus was no insignificant individual. He was an eques, a Roman knight, blessed with extreme wealth and a man of very powerful friends. Unlike Horace, Lucileus had the requisite freedom to say whatever he wanted to say. To be the son of a slave or of a former slave, as Horace was, meant that you were naturally set up to receive taunts, not to dole them out. Men of higher status had a certain purchase on you as a target of their abuse, a weapon easily triggered and always at the ready. Your purchase on them, to the extent that you had any at all, was greatly compromised. But Lucileus, the man who defined the satire for Romans of Horace's day, was by all accounts extremely well connected. The younger Scipio, the leading political figure of late 2nd century BCE Rome, counted Lucileus as his closest friend, and Lucileus was exceedingly wealthy. His rambling 3rd satire tells of his touring vast estates that he himself owned in southern Italy and Sicily. Through his sister, Lucileus would eventually, after his death, become the great uncle of none other than Pompey the Great. That kind of status was rare, if non-existent, for any other poet of his day, and that is the crucial point I would like to drive home to you. Not just in the case of Lucileus, but especially in the case of Horace, his imitator, the man who tried to pick up Lucileus's long-neglected sword of satire in his first book of Sermones, but found that sword terribly heavy and overburdening. My point is simply this. Lucileus's wealth and nobility had a powerful effect on the final generic look of his poems, besides exercising a profound influence upon the way we read them. Put differently, and as simply as I can, his genus, the standard Latin word for genre, is a condition of his genus. In fact, it's the same word, designating a person's family line and social class. The words are the same in Latin, not as a matter of chance, but because the concepts entail one another inextricably in Rome, that such that to say one is also to say and mean the other. Thus, for many Romans in Horace's audience who knew Lucileus's Saturae as poetry of a certain genre or class, Horace's ambition to rank as a satirist in his Sermones would have seemed far-fetched and foolhardy, with his failure a foregone and laughable conclusion. But why should that surprise us? That's the way it always was in Rome, and the way it would always be. A man's libertas, his free speech or freedom to speak, is equivalent to and only ever as good as his libertas, his freedom. Here again, we see that we have the same word used in quite different ways. The same word covers for the Romans what are for English speakers two distinct, though intersecting semantic domains. And there's no Oxford Latin dictionary at hand to tell Romans who use the word to keep freedom in column number 1 at a clear distance from free speech in column number 7. They knew such handy hierarchy. To put this differently, freedom for the elite Roman male, and these are the only ones who ever really had personal and political freedom in full, freedom is not something he merely possesses, it is something he does. It exists in performance, that is, in the day-to-day events, situations, and rituals that generally were thought to mark a man as free. Public invective, as an exercise in freedom or free speech, ranks among the most important of these status-generating, status-demonstrating rituals. Not only does it define its target as a deviant, that is, to attack someone in public, not only does this define its target as a deviant, but more importantly, it identifies the speaker as someone with the requisite auctoritas, authority, to criticize and to degrade another free, noble citizen. He is himself free, self-standing individual with full access to the ritual itself, a kind of generically encoded space that defines him as such. He possesses full freedom to use an aggressive voice, to speak freely against his inferiors or even against his equals. Only a precious few Romans enjoyed this right in ancient Rome. But what does that mean for Horace as someone who wants to write satire? Yes, he is himself an eques, a knight, by the time he writes his Sermones first book. But you would never know it from the way he writes himself into these poems. For example, in his fourth satire, again, you see this on number 1 of your handout. And I'll keep coming back to this poem, not only because you read it for today, but because it is the one where the poet first undertakes to set our Lucileus problem straight. He begins by telling us a tale that is by necessity not just about how Lucileus operated in his satires or what he said in them or about whom. Rather, it concerns who he was and what that necessarily entailed for the quality and volume of his voice. He writes, again, number 1 on your handout, if anyone deserved lampooning, that is, being made fun of in public, either because he was wicked and a thief, or because he was an adulterer or a murderer or notorious in some other way, they, that is, the writers of old comedy, the ones he's just named, would brand him with great freedom of speech. Multa cum libertate notabant. Lucileus stems from this entirely. Lucileus, at least in the strange tale that's told here, and it is a strange tale that I would urge you against taking at face value, Lucileus is as an attractive, purebred fruit hanging from a noble tree. He's a man of ancient, old comic pedigree. As we've already remarked, and as these lines make clear, this is not just a story of the famous libertas, free speech, that Lucileus is known to have employed in his satires, though that is precisely the way these lines are always taken. This is also the story of the freedom that he possessed in order to speak freely. That is, Horace is telling us in these lines where Lucileus's free speech came from, what it took for him to have it and to use it. This also, by extension, is the story of why he himself never will. Lucileus, like his counterparts in Greek old comedy from many centuries before, Lucileus possessed an impressive grade A freedom in abundance, multa cum libertate notabant. So he speaks in abundance. freely whatever he wants against whomever he chooses to name a sluggard or a scoundrel, someone worthy of being lashed with his censorial whip. I say this because there's a Roman censor metaphor working in these lines as well. The censor was a Roman statesman, one who held the highest and most powerful office of the state. He was in charge of regulating the morals of Roman senators and knights and using that power to determine the membership of the Roman Senate, a very powerful individual. Thus, Lucileus's satiric writing, as Horace constructs it in this poem, is an exact mirror image of the poet's powerful self, politically engaged, powerful, hyper-confident, unchecked, and prolific. That is Lucileus's problem, this poem says. Not only the thing that gave him his right to speak freely, it's the problem that Horace wants to center in on and criticize in Lucileus. He was sloppy and slapdash, no good Callimacheian poet. At the end of his first poem, Horace had defined his own restrained mode of satire in terms of a conviva satur, a dinner guest who has stayed a long while at the party, happily drinking, and who is by now stuffed to bursting and rather drunk. I have this as number 2 on your handout, so please have a look at that. Summing up the content of the satire, Horace says, let me grab a drink here. Summing up his first poem, Horace says, and that is why, because people are greedy, that is why it is so hard for us to find a man who will say that he has lived out his life in happiness and, content with time already spent, will step away from life like a dinner guest who has had his fill. Enough now, and in case you think I've been ransacking the writing boxes of bleary-eyed Crispinus, I'll add not a word more. Okay, here you have to understand that if this is what Horace does not say, but it's what is assumed, what the Roman audience would bring to this final statement of Horace. You have to understand that if this drunken dinner guest stays any longer, he will surely behave disruptively and say things that he should not. He will lose control and start hurling insults, causing scandal and embarrassment. But the smartly saturated guest described by Horace knows how to ride the edge of his drunkenness just long enough to enjoy himself to the full, like a good Epicurean, then leave. He reins himself in and holds back from breaking out with abuse. His counter-image is the petulant dinner guest, excoriated, scolded in the programmatic fourth satire, the man who piles onto the banquet's lowest seat, squeezing himself in as guest number 4 on a couch that's limited to 3 persons. This is number 3 on your handout. And again, it's from the poem that you read for today. So if you'll look at number 3, here Horace is scolding those who have criticized him. Horace writes, often you can see them at dinner parties sitting 4 to a couch. One of them loves casting aspersions on everyone there for any reason at all. On everyone, that is, except for the host. But once the man is good and drunk, he splatters him too. After Liber, that is the god of wine, but you can hear in this name the word for freedom. After Liber, who's always blurting out the truth, opens up the hidden recesses of his heart. That's your version of someone who's elegant, cultured, and free. This man, painted by Horace, this man, Horace implies, is so socially reckless that he gets completely drunk and splatters everyone with embarrassing abuse, including even the party's host. He is thus the very picture of limits unobserved and boundaries, fines, overstepped. Behavioral transgressions are here troped as spatial limits flouted and crashed. By the way, Roman couches could only fit 3 persons, not 4. Such spatial troping is easy to bring off inside a rich man's dining hall because in the triclinium, that is the Roman dining hall, all space is encoded to be expressive of one's place in that rich man's Roman world. The drunken, insult-spewing guest's lack of control, his ineptitude, the literal sense of this in Latin has to do with not fitting. His ineptia shows in this man's every gesture, right down to his cramped last-minute seat on the couch. But notice here, I'm not talking about literature anymore, or not exclusively so. The reference points I'm inviting you to meaningfully observe are not to literature, to old comic poets, for example, but to the protocols of Roman friendship, specifically to the behaviors expected of a lesser friend in the company of greater people. Note what Horace is doing with these drinking party images, besides prompting us to reckon with the books he has read. To help us think about good and bad satiric practices, Horace invites us to tag along with him to one of the parties he's been asked to attend, inside a rich man's dining hall, where we see guests drinking themselves silly or maintaining control, using speech that is either combative or restrained, and so on. He draws a clear and hard line, in other words, connecting his satires to his life in Rome, and other ways of satire to the ways of others' lives. And yet, all that said, there's a sneaky irony to be observed in Horace's use of the Roman cena, that is, the dinner party, the drinking party, and the controlled enjoyment of inebriation in this way as symbols of satire, good and bad. For to put his satiric practices in these terms is to recall the cultural as aesthetic language of the archaic lyric poets of ancient Greece, for whom the codes of social comportment at the symposium, that was their drinking party, came to set the terms of good song versus bad. These codes would eventually come to structure the language of Western poetics itself. Horace is therefore availing himself of a known Greek metaphorical system as a means of figuring his own generic principles for satire in these same terms. But the vehicle through which he tropes these principles, the Roman cena, that is, the formal and highly ritualized dinner party, with dinner guests behaving according to rank and adapting their behaviors to the unseen pressures of amakitia, friendship, referring to Roman patronage. This is an institution that his Roman audience would recognize not as archaic Greek, but as totally their own, and they would appreciate it for its incomparability and its much too obnoxious Romanness. Horace figures his satires in known Greek terms in order to underscore just how Roman they are. The cultural configures the literary in order to make it speak in a new and utterly Roman way. As for Lucileus, he never had to erase anything on his page. As in life, so in his writings, Lucileus never had to take back anything he said or did. He did not own an eraser, as it were, and he was proud of it. And he performs that freedom to live and speak as he pleases without apologies by writing the way he writes, taking nothing back. What an impressive freedom that was. For Horace, this is freedom, yes, but it is also a lack of refinement and self-control. Satire, as he inherited it from Lucileus, is a mess that he intends to clean up and refine. He writes and he erases, using both ends of the writing stylus. But can you see how weak and compromised Horace's Callimacheian makeover of satire might look to someone in his audience, especially to those so-called Lucileus fans who subscribe to certain rigid Stoic notions that figured verse technique as a natural reflection of the self. Can you see how Horace might raise eyebrows by tampering with that code, their code, writing as he writes, by comparison so carefully in such understated tones and in being so politically disengaged? Why lean so heavily on your eraser, Horace? What does that say about who you are? Is this the voice of a free Roman citizen, or is it not? What does it say about what has happened to satire? And are there any Luciliuses left in the Roman world? These are the kinds of questions, I believe, that can be and should be asked, not only of Horace's satires, but to the genre of Roman verse satire as a whole. For public politically engaged invective, that is, speech in an attack mode, such as that practiced by Lucileus, satire's brash inventor, is virtually non-existent in the genre as it was practiced by his descendants, Horace, Persius, Juvenal. And yet, as I've said, uncompromised invective was marked in Rome as one of the most important means of becoming and counting as a real Roman. And that remains true under the emperors as well. And thus, satire's programmatic shifts from open to understated to cryptic and so on can never be purely literary and apolitical in focus or tone. I read these shifts as the genre's unique way of staging and agonizing over a crisis in Roman identity, especially under the emperors. Here you have to remember that Romans had once been self-ruling, a republic rather than a fascist imperializing autocracy. In the movement from Lucileus to Horus and then on to Persius and Juvenal, we are made to feel and see deliberately performed before us the ever-tightening grip of Rome's totalitarian state. Horace's critics are extremely persistent. He addresses them repeatedly in his 2 books of satires. They are not done away with easily or at all by Horace's 2 books of sermones. But that was not the point of their being there to begin with. Rather, they remain a nagging source of pressure and a way of seeing the satirists' respective efforts at satire throughout the history of the genre. Each satirist after Horace recasts his Lucilius problem as theirs as well, theirs to solve, because each satirist steps into a generic arena where he is once again challenged to speak the way Lucilius had spoken, but none ever does. Instead, every writer of satire after Lucilius fights a losing battle against him, and by trying to fight it, they perform the activity of their losing it. Without question, Lucilius remains this genre's inventor and most celebrated practitioner in antiquity, not Horace, not Juvenal, and certainly not Persius. Studying Roman satire is thus comparable to being left the full epic output of, say, Ovid, Lucan, Statius, and Valerius, with only the merest scraps of Virgil to help us reckon with what their works mean. But Virgil, we know, is not just back there for these poets and incidentally referred to by them from time to time. He's an ever-present pressure put on them and always at the heart of how they mean what they mean. So too Lucileus in the sphere of satire. But this is something that commonly gets ignored in many studies of Roman verse satire. It's all too easy to show how each author accesses and remakes his predecessor's efforts in generic programmatic terms by way of bringing in Callimachus, for example, in Horace's case, or Stoicism in Persius's case, or whatever, and to leave it at that. It's much harder to relate these changes to the specific social and political conditions in which the individual authors found themselves working. But that's what needs to happen. For what happens to satire, I maintain, is not just the story of these several authors' individual generic choices in response to one another, though it's always that too. It is, above all, the story of their being denied choices, especially the choice to speak as Lucilius did, because of the increasing pressures centralized imperial oversight. Lucileus, the genre's unabashed inventor, built his machine to run loud and red hot. Horace retools it and tones it down, not just to prove that he's a compliant sort, or that he knows his place in the world, or that he possesses refined aesthetic sensibilities. He does it to put us in touch with the problem of his speaking freely in anything like the way Lucileus spoke in the nervous last days of the second triumvirate. Thus, for satirists after Lucileus, expectations inherited from him become a means for exploring the much bigger issue of what has happened to us Romans, to our language, and to our once uncompromised freedom, now that Lucileus and all that he stood for is long dead. Now, with all that said, you can perhaps see why Horace's father figures so prominently. That is, why it is crucial that he should figure so prominently in the discussion of the poet's habits of free speech, such as they are in Sermones 1:4. He's brought up again in poem 6, but we'll concentrate on the fourth poem. As we've seen, voice and rank entail one another for both Lucileus and Horace, so that each poet's genus, his genre, is expressive of and only as good as his genus, his family line and rank. At least Horace plays it that way in these poems. But that's precisely what makes his claims to have learned his habits of free speech from his father so odd, and at the same time so programmatically telling in his first book. How do you learn habits of free speech from a man of severely compromised freedom? Horace claims at Sermones 1:4, lines 103 to 5, I have this as number 4 on your handout. He says, if I've spoken too freely, liberius si dixero quid, or maybe jested too much, you'll forgive me. My noblest father trained me in the habit. Let's stop to think about his words here. Horace's father may have been noblest, optimus, in terms of his virtue and good sense, Oxford Latin Dictionary, optimus, paragraphs 1 through 2, but he was anything but noblest in terms of his status, Oxford Latin Dictionary, columns 5 through 6. Horace's libertas, in other words, the brand of free speech he shows us in his Sermones, book 1, he claims to have learned from a libertus, a man of severely compromised freedom. That restricted version of free speech must necessarily sound very different from the elite, uncompromised version of it that Lucileus had access to and seems to have used in his satires. And that's the point. Horace is driving a wedge between moral goodness and status, showing that the one does not automatically define the other. But what does Horace's restricted brand of freedom, such as it is, sound like? How does it express itself in satire? How can it express itself as satire at all? There's the problem. Near the end of his first hexameter satire, the Neronian satirist, that is, he wrote under the Emperor Nero, Persius, says of his two predecessors in the genre of formal verse satire, and I have this as number 5 on your handout, and I'd like to read that to you now. Persius says, Lucileus gashed or sliced into the city. It's a big, aggressive metaphor. You, Lupus, and you, Mucius. And he broke his molar, that is his back tooth, on men such as these. So there's a biting metaphor here. His friend, now he's talking about Horace, keeps right on laughing as crafty Flaccus touches his every defect. And once let in, he plays around his insides, a man sneaky smart at dangling a crowd from his well-blown nose. I could easily devote many hours to this short passage. This is Persius, after all, whose every word is overloaded and full of meaning, his satura crammed to bursting in that sense. I cannot get into all that's crammed in here, but let me just point to a couple of the more workable items, some of which are easily skimmed from the surface, and others are not. First, in the transition from Lucileus to Horus, whom Persius refers to as Flaccus here, you sense quite obviously that names are being lost, as Lupus and Mucius. These are the big political targets of Lucileus's Satires 1 and 2, respectively. These disappear in Horace, giving way to some anonymous friend, a person not named at all. The location of satire changes as well, from the public space of the city, the urbs, to the hidden recesses of a friend's inner emotional space, his praecordia, his deepest feeling insides, you might say his heart. And not only do places and targets change, but by the time you get to Horace, it is the target of the satiric operation, the unnamed friend, who is doing the laughing, not the satirist himself. So it's no longer a wolf attacking one wolf attacking another, but Flaccus, that is, Horace, playing for laughs in the comical role suggested by his cognomen, Flopsy. That's what the cognomen Flaccus means, with big floppy ears like a rabbit or a donkey. Every word of these lines merits more attention than I can give them here, but I want to look for a moment at the last thing that Persius says about Horus, when he calls him a man sneaky smart at dangling a crowd, or the common people, from his well-blown nose. What does he mean by that? The metaphor is curious and rare. In fact, Persius takes it from Horace's Satires, where it is used in the last satire of the second book to describe a low character at a dinner party. Once again, when you're talking about satire, notice you keep coming back to dinner parties. At this party, a very proud and snooty host has just served a gorgeous and elaborately described main course, when suddenly the curtains that hang above the table come crashing down and destroy the whole thing. When the dust settles, the guests come out from under their couches to survey the damage. They see the host, his name is Nasidianus, with his head in his hands, and he's crying, Horace says, as if his young son had just been cut down before his prime. The guests are embarrassed and don't know what to do. And it's exactly here that a low, heavy-drinking character named Balatro steps in to save the day. Horace writes, and I have this as number 6 on your handout. Let's look at that. Horace, in describing the scene, says, dangling all of this from his nose, suspendens omnia naso, there's Persius's metaphor, I've highlighted it in darker print. Balatro says, such is the deal that life gives us. And because of it, one's glory will never be an even match for one's toil. Just look at you torturing yourself so that I might be hosted in high style, racked with all manner of worry, making sure that the bread isn't burnt, that the sauce you serve is well seasoned, and that all your slaves are sprightly dressed and combed. And there are other disasters besides. What if the tapestry falls, as just happened now? Or maybe a bumpkin slips and breaks a plate. Still, it's the tough times that reveal the talents of a feast marshal, just as they do for a general, while easy times keep them hidden away. That's the end of the quote. Upon hearing these words from Balatro, the host picks up himself and says, bless you, Balatro, you're such a good man and a gracious dinner guest. Then he puts on his sandals and marches off to the kitchen to see to the cooking of the next dish, and then another and another. As a brave feast marshal, to use Balatro's funny term, off to do battle against his next foe. More wine is poured and the party keeps on going. And that, I think, is the point. Balatro kept this party from breaking apart. And he did so as someone keenly aware of his place at the table as a lesser friend of a powerful man, Horace's patron, Maecenas, who's the guest of honor at this party. In other words, he, The man who saves the day is not there for his own sake, but along for the ride to help Maecenas show well as a man of discerning tastes and interesting, well-behaved friends. As such, he cannot blurt out whatever he happens to be thinking. He cannot break out in laughter and deride the host as a fool, even though he seems to be one. Like Horace, he's a man of severely compromised free speech. And yet, despite all the constrictions that his friendship with Maecenas, his grand friend, puts upon his speech, he finds a way to play the satirizing buffoon and the gracious guest at the same time, toying with the idea that the smashed main course is the host's son tragically fallen before his time. He consoles Nausidianus using the words of a formal consolation, and thus he mimics the highly stylized language of that ritualized practice whereby one noble Roman responded encouragingly as a well-meaning friend to the grief of another. He dwells on the many unjust and fickle turns of life in a collection of sad old truisms that were normally reserved for losses both heavy and real. Here they are applied to burnt bread and broken plates. But as funny and potentially scorching as this seems, the touch is very light, and the criticism is hard to detect. For it's delivered not as a blast of abuse, but a humorous discontinuity, an awkwardness, an irony to be felt in the mismatch of the consolation's heavy framework, a dead child, to its frivolous contents, a ruined main course. As such, the criticism is there to be sensed by Nausidianus, the host, if he has the nose to sense it, and then thought about, and then, if all goes well, somehow taken to heart. Packaged this way, the critique does not injure or insult, but encourages Nausidianus to think, yes, my friend, you're right. This isn't such a big deal. And thus, back to the kitchen he goes. That's the backstory of Perseus's rare metaphor, the one he uses to describe Horus as a satirist, to help us think about how Horus was soft and sneaky, an ironist, not a wolfish attacker, compared to Lucileus. Perseus has us remember one of that satirist's sneakiest characters, who is himself a clever practitioner of satire, an inset and self-reflexive model of ironically counterpoised speech. For Perseus, it seems, Horus is Balatro, the dinner guest who must mind himself at Satyrs' outrageous feast. The son of a freed slave and a lesser friend of the great, he has much in common with Balatro. He cannot rail and bite, so he speaks in a different mode, carefully weighing his words to keep them, like so many fragrant apples in the pans of a scale, counterpoised and dangling. That's where this metaphor of suspension comes from. It has to do with balancing one thing against another in two pans of a scale. That's the way Horace's words are, says the metaphor, doubly loaded so as to keep the listener poised between options, leaning both this way and that. So much for Horace's clean-shot nose, but what of his hands? Perseus describes his Augustan predecessor as someone who could touch the most sensitive and painful moral faults of his target, and yet his friend, the target, the one he touches, would not cry out in pain. He would find it all quite funny and laugh. The metaphor that Perseus uses here comes from medicine, with vitium doing double duty as a moral vice as well as a physical ailment or defect. He's describing Horace as a physician, kind old Dr. Flaccus, who could get into a sick friend's insides as if by stealth without inflicting pain, as Lucileus had done when he sliced open his enemies, Lupus and Mucius. Through these images, Perseus describes a radical makeover in the bedside manner of satire in the transition from Lucileus to Horace. But he is also indicating that at the heart of this makeover was an utterly Roman cultural reality, friendship, and the pressures that it brought to bear upon the befriended poet's free speech. That one word, amico, friend, I suggest, is the most sneaky and telling word in Perseus's encapsulation of Horus. For it puts a hard Roman limit on what we might otherwise take as a self-consciously Hellenizing endeavor on Horace's part. That is, his Socratic ironizing makeover of a genre that was, by reputation, if not in actual fact, entirely Roman. Instead, the particular emphasis given to the word here by Persius suggests that however much room Horace may have made for Greek materials and methods in his refashioned version of satire, his refashioning is to be taken as something other than an attempt to Hellenize the genre, as if thereby to display his learned Greek credentials. Rather, he did so as his way of speaking freely, given who he was. That is, it was his way of being a Roman and the next Lucileus down the line, his way of speaking freely within a Roman cultural milieu wherein he was himself the lesser friend of greater men. To be a Roman, Persius says, a practitioner of that one library-worthy Roman genre that many critics define by its very Romanness, Horace had to Socratize the genre. He had to make it Greek. When Persius thinks back on Horace, he remembers him not as a satirist making enemies, but a friend critiquing and keeping a friend. I hope by now to have shown that Persius's delineation of Horace as a deft handler of friends is a good fit for both the theorization of satire offered up by those poems, as well as for their actual practice. But I hope also to have indicated along the way that this refashioning of satire, Graiko-ritu, in the Greek style, is best told not as yet another tired tale that features brutish Romans being made to shave their shaggy beards and dress neatly and behave, nor is it about how that one last bastion of Roman ferocity, the outpost manned by Italy's last native insurgent, Lucileus. Rather, this is a story about how Greeks, those old comic poets and Socrates and Bion, Epicurus, and other learned friends whom Horace had gotten to know in the travels he took in his books, had been made to speak like Romans by a Roman as part of their acculturation and a basic precondition of their being able to speak meaningfully in Rome at all. It's about how their entry into Rome was never on the terms that they happened to have set for themselves, whatever we might imagine those terms to have been. For these cultured Greeks whom we encounter in and as Roman writings are not, as it were, public intellectuals on some ancient goodwill tour out to convert the unwashed masses of benighted Italians, and thus free to traverse the distance from their own there to Horace's here without having to pay the price of their translation or to adjust themselves, their comportment, their purposes, and their thinking, all rather radically to the demands of the local culture. Rather, the terms of their entry into Rome are precisely those that they have been set for them by their sponsors, their auctores who undertook to bring them to Rome in the first place and to make them speak Latin for whatever reasons that they may have had in mind. To my students who tend to think of translation as a fairly simple exercise of plugging words into a Google Translator text box, I like to point out just how aggressively physical, and need I say it, Roman, the Roman concept of translation actually is. Translatio, I tell them, has a full and interesting life in Latin writing in decidedly non-metaphorical usage, where it means to bring across, transferre, that is, as one would bring across a statue from a temple in Greece and bring it over on a ship to be reinstalled in an atrium, a bath, or a library in Rome. It is, in other words, a term that applies just as fully and accurately to the activities of those conquering generals who used triumphal ceremony as a means of putting on display what powerful and clever translators they were, as it does to the works of those poets who commonly used images of conquering generals to figure their poetic triumphs. the ones that they won in translating Greek works into Latin. The troping, I say, is not coincidental because in a certain fundamental sense, in Rome, it isn't a trope. For being hauled across, transferred, is in fact what happens to entire libraries taken from the Greek world and reinstalled in Rome. And it's what happens yet again when those same Greek books are brought over to the Latin wing of the Roman library by way of their translation, where they're set in place as matching, yet often highly metaphorical versions of their Greek originals. In every case, these books are physical translations, things actually hauled over, taken control of, put on triumphal display, as much as they are metaphorical ones. Okay, I think by this point, I've said all I have to say, so I'm going to end my lecture here and let you ask any questions that you might have, and I thank you for your time.
Okay, so Professor, may I request you to kindly switch off your microphone?
Okay.
I'm really sorry. I mean, it's echoing, so I wanted to avoid that. So we had a very engaging lecture. I'll be coming back to it during the last section of our discussion, which would be the concluding remarks from me. But before that, I would request our students, and with your permission, Professor, knowing our students being a little hesitant, I would ask you if it's okay if they mention their queries in the chat box in their regional language, and I would be translating them to you to the best of my abilities. Okay, so students, tomra jodi, Professor, I'm switching over to our regional language for a moment. Okay, students, তোমরা যদি বাংলাতেও প্রশ্ন করতে চাও সেটা তোমরা চ্যাট বক্সে লিখে ফেলতে পারো, আমি সেটা ট্রান্সলেট করে ওনার সামনে রাখবো, বাট উনি উত্তরটা ইংলিশেই দেবেন। সো আমি তোমাদের অনুরোধ করছি, তোমরা যদি প্রশ্ন থাকে তোমরা করতে পারো। আর অফকোর্স মানে তোমরা, if you want to switch on your microphone and speak directly in English, that's also fine. So we wait for your comments, questions, and observations. But while we do that, I myself would like to ask something that I have in my mind for a pretty long time, and I think you, Professor, would be one of the best persons to ask this. I'm always curious about etymologies. Whenever I have studied any genre for that matter, I have always tried to engage with the etymological roots. And if we look at Satires' etymological root, which you have so wonderfully explained, lang satura, towards the beginning of your lecture, we also come across this notion, which albeit was a mistaken one, that satire for a considerable amount of time was linked to satyr, S-A-T-Y-R, satyr as well. So could you please comment on that? And I would also request you to comment, I mean, if memory serves me right, this confusion for the English writers stayed on for a pretty long time until it was cleared probably during the 17th century by some writer. So did that have any significant influence on English satire writers as well? So I would like to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you're not the only one who's interested in etymologies. The ancient writers were very interested in the etymology, and they did a lot of arguing about where this word satura comes from in Latin. The basic adjective in Latin is satur, which means stuffed and full, sort of bursting full. And you see that in that one metaphor of the satura lanx, the sort of dinner plate or ritual trencher that's filled with all sorts of things. And this seems to be a metaphor that was popularized by a Roman writer named Varro, and he is the great etymologist of the 1st century BC. and he wrote Satires himself. So he had a lot of insight into this. Unfortunately, his writings are very scattered, and it's very hard to put together how it all worked. And I have written on this a very large piece on the different etymologies that were around and available in the 1st century BC. That was one of the main ones, but by no means the exclusive one. If you look at that handout that I gave you, you don't have to look at it now. At the end of that first poem of Horace, when he uses this phrase "jam satis est," he's doing an etymological play there. He says satire, as Lucileus practices, as these loudmouths like this person he names Crispinus do it, is one of this overdone, overloaded plate. I'm doing it as "jam satis est," which is a difference between a long A, satura, versus a short A, satis. Satis means enough, knowing when it's enough, not too much. So it's kind of an opposite from overdone to sufficient. And so he's playing a different etymological game to describe his own satires. Now, as you said, the other big, and Varro does explore this, and other ancient writers explore this, is what's the relationship between satire as a genre and the satyrs, right? And satyr play. You realize that satyr play was, these were put on in ancient Greece. They were like comedies. And they're of, you know what satyrs are? They're these goat-like Pan figures who are very funny. And so you saw that in antiquity as well. People connecting that Roman satire with satyrs, and that's a Greek word, not a Latin word. Okay, and so again, it's a long versus short in terms of the A. And I point this out in one of my writings, and it's very interesting that the word satire as the genre and the word satiric, meaning satirical, the adjective, they are not etymologically related. One comes through satyrs, that is these Greek mythological creatures, and the other comes through satura, which is this genre we've been talking about, and the Latin term. So it's very complicated. And when the British, for example, in British satire, when they receive the ancient materials, they're aware of a lot of these etymologies, because in the 4th and 5th centuries there were these grammarians. Some were writing in Greek and others in Latin. They were very interested in this problem, and they tend to produce all sorts of even more etymologies. So there are maybe a dozen or more altogether, and I've talked about some of them, and some of them are quite fanciful. But by the time the British satirists get a hold of this stuff, they have access to all sorts of etymologies, and they can kind of play it as they like. But I think the main one earlier on is the satyr, that is the animal creature thing, and it's only as they figure this out that it changes. I'm not sure it changes the way they write very much, but it changes their conceptualization of what they write. So.
Okay, so many thanks for that wonderful clarification, Professor. So we are still waiting for students to raise their queries, but I must also add that the lecture itself was so comprehensive that it would probably take a little time for our students to let that all sink in, and then maybe the questions would generate. But I am going ahead with my second query that again I have had this in my mind for a very long time. I have also been interested in many genres, afterlives, and satire definitely happens to be one of my key interests along those lines. So, Professor, I would like to request you to kindly share your views on the afterlives of satire particularly the Horatian strain, if we may call it so, for our present day popular or even literary culture?
Sure. Satire, as you know, when in English, when we use that word now, it tends to be a very broad term. It can include just about anything. And most Americans or English speakers don't even realize there was an ancient version of this that gave the name, right? Romans were very proud of this satura thing because, as Quintilian says in the late first century, he thinks that this is the one genre that we Romans invented, that we didn't inherit it from the Greeks. Horace is playing a very weird game there when he says, oh, well, Lucileus just got it all from the Greeks, from these old comic poets. This is sure to make certain critics of his make their heads explode in anger, because it sort of it makes this automatic connection between what some thought, this is what makes us Roman. It makes us independent culturally from the Greeks, and to say, oh no, we just got it entirely, he says, from Greek old comedy, which is this is a kind of crazy overstatement. So Romans had a lot at stake personally. You notice when they talk about satire and where it comes from and what it means, they get very hot. They're angry about it because they have so much of themselves wrapped up in it. It has to do with what a real Roman is. For whatever reason, Juvenal is our last satirist. I didn't really talk about him, writing in the early 2nd century. And he's the one who kind of defines a certain kind of satire that really does get picked up on again in later times. And the British satirists tend to, when they undertake to write satires in a kind of imitation of the Romans, it kind of begins with certain British satirists in the 17th century mostly imitating Roman satire by sort of updating it, translating it, but using certain topical issues of their own day instead of from antiquity, but using a lot of the same old names and things like that. But they tend to divide into either the Horatian, that is, people who are sort of in a softer, ironic mode of Horace. And you have to remember that Horace was popular as a writer of things that weren't satire as well. In fact, mostly he's most famous for his odes, which are lyrical poems, very much in the mode of archaic Greek lyric poetry. He was the one in Rome that really perfected that, and he took tremendous pride in that. He didn't have to apologize about anything for that. You see, when he's writing satire, which is his earliest stuff, he's very much sort of looked down upon, and his every move is being scrutinized in ways that it's clear that not everybody's approving. So the British satirists, which I've done some with the reception of British satire, there's some French satire that's I think is very interesting, but they tend to choose their mode, whether to write in a Horatian mode or Juvenalian mode, which Juvenal is very loud. He's the one who says, I'm doing Lucileus again. He's not politically, it's a weird thing because he's writing in the 2nd century and he does attack a lot of political figures, but he only attacks political figures who are dead from many, many years before, from the previous century. So there's this weird sort of false claim that I'm going to be writing in the mode of Lucileus again, attacking political figures, which he does, but they're only ones that are long dead and are now in their own way irrelevant. Actually, they're never really irrelevant. I don't know why in the 2nd century AD, Romans keep on writing again and again and again about the emperors of the 1st century BC. It just becomes more and more important for them to do that. And Juvenal is doing it too. So in a way, it's probably very politically relevant, but in ways that are kind of mysterious to me. I've always wanted to figure that out. So there's plenty of forms of modern satire. I don't know, mostly on the American scene, we think of satire not so much as in a written form, but as things that happen on the internet and on comedy shows. So it's a very different. It's a very full and rich world of satire out there, but it really is now so very much detached from. I see one from Pratai. Did I say it right? About the difference between sarcasm and satire.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Pratai, for that question.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, the difference is one of degree, I would say. When one of these days, I'd like to write a piece on bad humor in antiquity, because all writers who undertake to write satire in this or comedy, for example, the old comic poets that Horace mentions, they all kind of give you examples of what not to do, of bad humor, and the sort of stuff they're not going to do, right? Horace gives you examples of the kind of nasty satire he won't engage in. Perseus does the same thing. He says at the end of his first satire, you people out there think it's funny to make fun of a one-eyed man by calling him one-eyed. You know, it's just, and so every satirist and every comic poet has their sort of examples of the kind of humors that are too much or are not funny. And sarcasm has to do with it's actually a Greek word that has to do with slicing into. It has to do with sarx, the flesh. You know, it's a kind of cutting metaphor, and it's sort of irony, but that's over the top. And how to explain the difference between irony and sarcasm? Satire can be ironic. It doesn't have to be. It can be very direct. Horatian satire is highly ironic in that it can make indirect. It's sort of critical attack. It's through an indirect direction, and it has to do with the mismatch of the a sort of perception of a mismatch between the message and you know, there's this message and its meaning and how they keep together. Sarcasm, there's no mystery about that, right? Horace, you could say, what just happened here, and is he making fun of someone or is he not? Sarcasm doesn't leave you any sort of doubt about that. It's a very cutting sort of mocking of someone else's habits. And the ancient writers are onto that. They don't actually have access to that term, though. Irony is an interesting term that they do have access to, and that's largely through Socrates, who sort of invents it as a literary thing and examples it, or Plato examples it in the way Socrates goes after the people he's relating to. Interestingly, they don't really have a word for parody either. Parody is another thing where you're parodying something you're mocking it, but you're sort of overdoing something. You're mimicking it and sort of pointing out how silly it is at the same time. They do have the word parody. It's a Greek term, but it doesn't mean the same thing to them as it does to us. So it's interesting to see a lot of these categories that we take for granted in English of sarcasm, irony, parody, as sort of ways of defining kinds of humor. They don't have the same access or easy access to terms that do that for them. So they have to find other ways to describe it. And that's why I talk about these satirists who, instead of saying things like you're too sarcastic, they'll give examples of the kind of jokes they don't approve of and won't tell. So it's a kind of a different world back then, when the very terms, the critical terms we use, are under construction and being developed. Actually, parody is a very interesting one, because I just had a student do a PhD dissertation on the development of that term and how it comes into being, and how ancient writers in Greece and Rome did things we regard as very parodic, but they had to find ways to talk about that are very different. So I hope that helps.
Well, Professor, that was very interesting. I mean, I myself feel very interested to read this dissertation, this doctoral dissertation you just mentioned, because I myself am very curious about the origins of parody. But let's come to the second question, which is asked by our student, Pooja. Pooja's question is, what do you make of Horace's self-praise and self-mockery, and of his personal presence in so many poems?
Right. That is a big, it's a very smart question. Most poetry, for example, if you read, Horace was a good friend of Virgil, the great epic writer, but Virgil's also a writer of all sorts of other kinds of poetry, such as bucolic poetry. He writes things called the Georgics. But those genres don't really allow the poet to bring himself in, right? If you can read the entirety of Virgil's Aeneid, and he doesn't tell you anything about himself, he's just this voice, right? Satire, and this seems to have been one of the innovations of Lucileus. Satire is a very large part of it. And we, for Lucileus, remember, he wrote 30 books of satires. We have none of those books left, but we have around 1,100, actually more, just over 1,100 fragments of those poems. And some of those fragments can be quite large. Some of them are just tiny little bits of this and that. But it's clear from those fragments that he told us a lot about himself. We know how rich he was and who his friends were, the parties he attended, who he made fun of. So satire, as Lucileus had set it up, was a kind of autobiographical genre where you were expected to talk about yourself as a Roman, as someone who grew up in Rome, and you talked about your friendships and the parties you went to and things like that. So this it's very interesting because that's not going on in a lot of Roman poetry. It happens also in Greek poetry. It was mostly iambic poetry where you saw this. Iambic poetry is mostly associated with 7th and 6th century BC, sort of late archaic Greek poets such as Archilochus, for example, or Hipponax. And they, in fact, that's another kind of humor that Horace engages in. He writes something called the Epodes as well, which we can read that book. It's 17 poems long, and it's all in iambic epodic meters. I'm not going to get into that, but he's not very forthcoming about himself, but he's very forthcoming about his hatreds and who he doesn't like and the battles he's fighting there. But that's one place where Horace, it's in Rome, it's mostly about, are you allowed to name other individuals in your poetry in negative, critical ways? And you really had to be somebody to do that. Lucileus was somebody, and he could get away with it. Horace can't. But he has this other set of poems called the Epodes, where he does name people, but they're mostly nobodies. They're not people they're not people that anybody cares about, right? And so there's another sort of one might have expected him to have a kind of iambic mode in his satires, but he doesn't. He just creates two separate worlds, one of ironic satires and the other of a more aggressive mode in his Epodes. And these are kind of two worlds that were together in Lucileus, because his first several books of satires are in iambic meters, which I won't get into that too much, but it's also the meter of stage productions, including old comedy of the Greeks. So I've strayed from the question. Now I'm trying to think back to where this all started. It had to do with including himself in his poetry. And yeah, this is one of the things that makes it so very interesting, is that it does allow for the author to talk about himself. Now, I do think he talks about himself in very sort of, it's a kind of illusion that you're getting access to the life of this poet through his poetry, because so much of what he does in describing himself kind of seems too good to be true, because it seems like a version of things we know from literature rather than from just random things in someone's life. For example, in that poem you read for today, a lot of what happens at the end of that poem, his interactions with his father, good stuff has been written on that, about how many of those things that are going on there were actually things that occur in a famous play, a comic play by the poet Terence, who wrote in the 2nd century BC. And Terence describes in one of his stage productions, a comedy, interactions between a kindly old father instructing his son, and you can just sort of see ways in which they line up even verbally very closely. So Horace is describing himself, but it's also being modeled and shaped by other literary structures. And so there's a kind of danger in just assuming that we know we have access to a real life here, because it's all being shaped in literary ways for our appreciation as that as well. Okay?
Okay, so we have another question, a pretty loaded one, I would say.
Okay.
But it's rather short. It's from our student Sabana. Sabana is asking about Horace's defense of satire. I think she actually wants to know, I mean, what would be the politics behind doing that?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot there. When Horace is defending satire in the poem you read, and in the first book and second book generally, he's defending it against people who love satire, but who don't like his version of satire. So he's defending his version of it, which is a very, as I've said, is very different from what Lucileus did, and people want that. At least some out there in the world want that. Now, the politics of Horace's first book is very interesting, because this was published, whatever we take that to mean, in about 35 BCE. So if you think about the times, Horace is from South Italy. He's from Apulia, a town called Venosa in modern Italy. And somehow he makes his way into the world of Roman education, but also Roman politics. When he was a young man, he went to, even though he talks about his father being a freed slave and being a farmer down in southern Italy, it's clear his father was very wealthy. So there's another place where the autobiography doesn't quite match up, because this father brought his son to be educated in Rome, with the best teacher in Rome, where all the best young noblemen were sending their kids. And then Horace goes off to Athens in Greece to study philosophy, which again is that's a very, that's very up there in terms of social cachet and wealth. And when he was in Athens in 43, 42 BC, so 7 or 8 years before these poems were published, you know that Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44, in March of 44. And Brutus, the main assassin, then goes off to the east. And when Brutus was in Athens, he meets Horace. And he picks up Horace and makes him one of his military tribunes. Horace was just really a young man, a kid, but he was fighting for the cause of libertas, freedom. This is the very thing that this is the word I was talking about. It's so important in that poem, but it's also the word that Brutus is putting on his coin. There are coins of Brutus from 44, 43 BC, where he has the word libertas on it. That's it. And he has two knives or daggers on it, you know, which he used to kill Julius Caesar. So Horace was into this cause, and it was a losing cause, obviously, because the assassins of Caesar end up being on the wrong side of history. Not that they were on the wrong side of politics, but they end up being defeated. And then by the time Horace is writing, there's this sort of an unsure balance between the old senatorial conservative order, and that would be Brutus and Pompey's son, Sextus Pompey, and sort of sees the Caesarians, Octavian at this point. So they're holding it together, but just barely. In fact, that's one of the great interesting things about this first book. It's published in 35, and just within a few months before it's published, Sextus Pompey is defeated by Octavian and Agrippa off the waters of Naulicus in Sicily. I mean, it's got all this warfare around it and people actually being killed in huge numbers, but you would never know that happened from these poems. Now, Lucileus was best friends of Scipio Aemilianus Africanus, and Lucileus was a soldier who fought with Scipio in Spain, and he includes all sorts of stuff about his life as a soldier with this great general as his satires. Horace fought in these wars. He fought at the Battle of Philippi. He talks about this in his odes, but not in his satires. You would think it would be there, right? So you can see how the autobiography is there. There's lots of politics surrounding these poems, but by this point, he's kind of blocked it off as outside the genre as he's going to remake it. So it's one of the really interesting things. I've done an awful lot on this, and it's one of the sort of expectations that many might have had of his poems that just do not get met at all. So I hope that helps. There's and then he does write a second book of satires, the one I've just written a book on, and those are published right after the Battle of Actium. This is when Octavian defeats Antony and Cleopatra, and then he's now the autocrat. The beginning of the Roman Empire really starts with him, and so the world is very different. Horace does talk about politics a tiny bit in that first poem, and that's worth reading. It's about what's that going to do to my voice as a satirist, now that Octavian is the only guy that matters and who judges whether I'm speaking properly or not. It's a very interesting poem for the politics of the moment.
Okay, so I think we have the last question. I would request students not to place any more questions because it's just the beginning of the day for Professor, and he would have a very tight schedule ahead. I can guess that. So
Sure.
Pooja has this question: whether the Horatian satires are driven by any general governing value or set of related values, or they're just made of random observations.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. How do you conceive of a sort of centrality to these poems where they do seem rather one's about this and others about that? That was my big challenge in the book I just wrote about the second book, because they are even more erratic than the first. And that was the fun I had, was to try to determine what could be, how to make sense of them as a book. This is one thing that happens in this period when poets are writing these books of collected poems. They are doing so in such a way that randomness is something that seems to there is a randomness to it, but underneath at some level there is a strong connection that binds it together as a book with a beginning and a middle and an end. So in terms of what holds these all together, I guess it's the voice of the poet himself. In the first book, this is very different in the second book because he backs away and lets others do the talking. So it's a very different project. But in the first book, he is the voice, and the way he shapes his voice and sort of assesses issues, but also in terms of his ironic insights into the situations that he's describing. And it's very hard to see what's funny about a lot of it. And this is one of the hard things about ancient humor, is that so much of it is topical, and it's so hard. If you have to explain a joke and get really deeply into it, you're not laughing by that point. And that's the trouble with ancient humor. Some of it's right there as very cutting and ironic for their ancient audience, but we have to go through all these processes to appreciate, oh, okay, I can see how that might be funny. So I'd say that's the connective tissue there is Horace's irony and his invitation. In his first poem, he basically gives you a script for how to read them. It's not the poem we read, but he says something there. Why are you laughing? He's just told a little story, and he says, why are you laughing at that? This story is about you. And that's the way his poems work. It's that they keep you on your toes, because as soon as you start laughing at that, as if the problem is out there in the world, he turns it in a way that says, no, you're the problem. And this is something that Perseus, this Neronian satirist, really picked up on, because he wrote under the Emperor Nero. And I don't know if you know about the Emperor Nero, but talk about how do you write satire under that emperor, okay? And Perseus does this very interesting thing, and I wish we would learn it in our own world, especially in America right now, where Perseus wrote satire in a world where everybody in the world blamed all their problems on Nero. And he would float images of that out there as funny, but then he would turn it on you and say, Nero's not the problem. It's Nero inside of you. You've all got a Nero inside of you. That's the problem. It's a very stoic turn, but Horace had already done this. Remember, for Lucilius, all the problems in the world were out there. You just had to point at them and attack them. For Horace, he's a philosophical satirist, an ironist, who wants to let you laugh. Go ahead and laugh, but now look at how that involves yourself. And one of the main persons he turns it on is himself. This is consistent. I can make you laugh, and it's not so threatening because I'm the fool here. I'm describing problems I have. But the problems that he makes you laugh at also are problems that certain people in the Roman world had, such as his big friend, his patron, who's the number 2 political figure in Rome at this time, Maecenas. And so this is especially true of his second book, is that he's getting you to laugh at himself, his own foolishness, but at the same time, he's implicating all sorts of other people into this world. And so the laughter becomes a little more edgy. And you can see real satire is happening here, because it's easy to think, he didn't write satire, he's not attacking people. You have to go to Juvenal or Lucileus for that. He's like, there's some really sneaky. In fact, I think the most political satirist of all was Perseus, even though he doesn't attack anything directly. It's all indirectly. But my goodness, it's very much of the moment, and it has to do with living under Nero. So Horace is the one who shaped that idea for Perseus to really develop. And so I'd say that's the real sort of continuous thread in Horace, is wherever he's going, he's doing that. It's hard to explain, but there it is.
No, I am really, I think all of us feel very special the way you are engaging with each of the questions with so much of interest. Sabana still has a question, Professor. So I would understand if your schedule permits it or not, but
Okay, I'll take one more because I have to meet
okay,
some
Sabana,
students.
please be fast with your question. This is going to be the last question for the day.
Glad to do it.
Okay.
I don't see it. Is it there?
Yeah, I think she is still typing it.
Oh,
Sabana,
okay.
we are waiting for you to type it out. Okay.
There it is. What is Horace?
Okay. Again, a very loaded one. I don't think it's possible to answer this very shortly.
I'll just say that book you referred to, The
Yes.
Walking Muse. That was where the subtitle of that is Horace's Theory of Satire. Now that's a
Yes.
very old book by now. I wrote that in the 90s, and that was
Yes,
my
but
PhD.
probably I will be able to get a soft copy of that from archive, and I will be sharing
Yeah,
that. So,
I could
Sabana,
probably. Yeah.
yeah,
So
please.
it's a very big question, and if I were to I think the book needs to be rewritten now. Now that I've done the second book of Satires, and that book is actually out from Cambridge. I just haven't updated my CV. I can now, because most of that book was on his theory of satire, had to do with the first book, and now I've got both books that I've really kind of, and I see how different they are, but also what connects them. So his theory of satire is basically everything I've said today and more. And it's also has to do with what I just said before. But I think the emphasis in what I said today, and this is a thing that really didn't happen until I started writing on this a while ago, is that to see the cultural stakes, this dinner party stuff, for example, how everything has to be, all this literary critical talk has to be sort of aligned with cultural expectations. And he uses very specific ritualized activities to help you understand what his theory of satire is. To do that, I'm going to take you to dinner parties. And he does it repeatedly to help you understand what the limits are of free speech, how to behave oneself, and not to act like this or that or that. And it's from those moments of watching people get it right or wrong, or sound right or sound wrong, that you come to appreciate what his theory of satire is. So in a way, you're kind of disadvantaged because you've just focused on the one poem where he's talking about it. But it kind of exists as this sort of ongoing conversation. That's what sermo means. Sermones is the title he gives it. It's part of a longer ongoing conversation that you derive from the entire book and then from the entire next book. So I'll leave you to do that, and that'll be great.
Yes. So I come to the last part of our session. That is, Professor, I would again request you to switch off the microphone.
Okay.
Still echoing. Okay, so I feel really honored to deliver the concluding remarks for this wonderful discussion that we just had. I would not take much, but I would I just can't help adding this, that I think our speaker has also mentioned this, that it's very difficult to properly appreciate ancient texts because they are so far removed from our time. But yes, I would also add that our lecture today has pointed us that they are so far and yet so close. He has very successfully related this to our own time, but not only is this lecture relevant for this evening in India or morning in America, but I think this lecture being archived in YouTube would serve many enthusiasts of classical literature, classical Latin poetry in times to come. So I think, Professor, we witnessed something that is going to stay with us, stay with academia, if I may call it so. I'm probably making a little bit of tall claim, but I feel that way. So I really can't thank you enough, Professor, for being with us for the entire morning. Have a very good day and prosperous year ahead. And students, I know you are very thankful to Professor. So on your behalf, I am thanking Professor for this wonderful lecture. So with that, I think we should call it a day.
And I'll just add one last thing, and
Yeah,
that
please,
is,
please,
um,
please.
if anybody would like to follow up and send me an email with a question, I'd be glad to talk to you a little more. So it was a
Yes,
pleasure,
yes. So,
to.
Professor, I would be sharing your email ID with the students. I
Great,
think they will, because I think they will be revisiting your lecture a couple of times, and then they would be having a lot of questions. I'm
great.
sure about it. So thank you again, Professor, and
Okay.
and have
Have
a
a
very
great,
good.
have a
Yeah,
great evening. Good
yeah.
night.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, 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 students. The session is over now. I'm stopping the recording, and I would request all of you to